The Red Mesa River carved through Colorado territory like a silver blade that spring morning in 1875, its waters carrying more than snowmelt from the towering peaks. Hidden beneath the rushing surface lay the lifeblood of 3 Lakota bands whose ancestors had followed this waterway for countless generations, trusting in its eternal promise to sustain them through drought and plenty, through the changing seasons that marked the passage of time, in a land where time itself seemed carved from stone and sky. The band had ranged south that season, trading and hunting along the Red Mesa Valley, a movement not unusual in the years of shifting treaties and trails. Tocala Iron Bear crouched behind weathered limestone that jutted from the riverbank, like the bones of ancient giants watching catastrophe unfold across the torrent with the focused intensity of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after months of patient stalking. But today, he was not the hunter. Today, something had gone terribly disastrously wrong with the most important mission of his 28 years. A mission that could determine whether his people survived as a nation or withered into memory like so many tribes before them. The woman stumbling through willows on the far bank was supposed to be safely inside Victor Holsted's compound. By now playing her carefully rehearsed role as the naive German bride, while gathering intelligence about the water rights conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything Tocala's people had built along this sacred river over generations of careful stewardship. Instead, she was running for her life through riverside brush, with 3 armed riders closing fast behind her, their horses lathered and wild-eyed from hard pursuit across dangerous terrain. Thunder and lightning, he thought, unconsciously echoing his grandfather's favorite oath, while his mind raced through tactical options that all seemed to end in disaster. The whole blessed operations blown to smithereens. For 6 months, ever since the Lakota Council had received Yazi's dying message about the death of water, they had been tracking disturbing rumors about Holsted's true intentions in Red Mesa country. Not just the obvious land-grabbing and mining claim manipulation that territorial authorities might eventually notice and investigate, but something far more sinister. Something that would give him godlike power over water itself in a land where water meant the difference between flourishing communities and bleached bones scattered across alkali flats. The woman, she called herself Leonora Richter. Though Tocala had suspected from their first coded communication that the name was as carefully fabricated as her mail-order bride story, had been their only hope of getting close enough to Holsted's inner circle to confirm what Yazi had died trying to prove. That Victor Holsted, wealthy Eastern investor turned frontier kingmaker, was planning to redirect the Red Mesa River's entire flow through artificial means, turning traditional Lakota lands into worthless wasteland, while making himself the sole controller of water rights across 3 counties and dozens of settlements. The plan had seemed foolproof when the tribal council and their unlikely Pinkerton allies had conceived it during clandestine meetings in remote canyons, where ancient petroglyphs watched over conspirators plotting against a different kind of invasion. Eleanor Hartwell, her real name revealed only after weeks of careful negotiation between tribal elders and federal investigators, would infiltrate Holsted's social circle, using the perfect cover of European mail-order bride, a role that would grant her access to his private residence, while arousing minimal suspicion from men who viewed women as decorative objects rather than potential threats. Yazi had discovered the conspiracy's first traces 2 winters past, during what everyone believed was routine railroad survey work contracted through the Territorial Engineering Office. Geological markers that made no sense for railroad construction, positioned at angles suggesting someone was planning to move vast quantities of water, rather than lay track across relatively flat terrain. Test holes drilled at specific intervals along canyon walls, each one placed with mathematical precision that spoke of larger design invisible to casual observation. Strangers with expensive surveying equipment, taking measurements in narrow gorges where no railroad could ever run, working under cover of darkness and departing before dawn like ghosts with clipboards and theodolites. When Yaji had started asking pointed questions about these irregularities, drawing attention to patterns that didn't match official survey documentation, professional killers had silenced him with bullets from concealment, leaving only cryptic warnings about the death of a water, whispered through blood-frothed lips to his cousin who arrived too late to save him. But in time to hear his final testimony about conspiracy reaching territorial government itself. Now their carefully planned infiltration was collapsing into deadly chaos, and Tokola faced a choice that would determine whether Yaji's sacrifice had any meaning beyond adding another name to the long list of Indians who had died trying to protect their people from white men's greed. The lead writer's voice carried over the water's roar with cruel satisfaction that spoke of man who enjoyed his work too much. "There's our little spy. Victor wants to ask you some very pointed questions about what you were doing in his private study, with that fancy wet plate apparatus, glass plates, and a sliding box field camera, sweetheart, spy." So they knew. Somehow, despite months of meticulous preparation and a cover story that had been tested through multiple scenarios, Victor Holstead had seen through their deception with the paranoid instincts of someone who had built his empire on systematic betrayal of trust. The woman who had risked everything to infiltrate his operation was now running for her life with information that could save 3 Indian bands or die with her in the Colorado wilderness. Tokala's paint horse shifted restlessly behind him, sensing his rider's tension through the subtle language of muscle and breathing that connected all experienced partnerships between man and animal. The horse was trained for river crossings had to be, when your survival depended on reading water. Like other men read books, understanding current and depth, and the 1,000 subtle signs that meant the difference between safe passage and drowning in muddy water, that cared nothing for human ambitions. But crossing that deadly torrent under hostile fire to save someone who might already be doomed was the kind of calculated risk that got good horses and better men killed for nothing more than gesture, leaving their people without crucial intelligence that had been purchased with blood and months of dangerous preparation. Then she looked across the rushing water and locked eyes with him, and Tokala saw something that changed every calculation he'd been making about risk and necessity and the mathematics of survival. Not panic, not the helpless terror of a victim facing inevitable capture, and whatever followed in Victor Holstead's private interrogation chambers. What he saw across 50 yards of deadly water was cold professional assessment, the look of someone evaluating tactical options with trained precision and finding them limited but not impossible. This was no amateur playing at espionage to satisfy romantic notions about adventure and justice. This was a professional who had been burned by circumstances beyond her control, but was far from finished fighting. Great thundering buffalo, he realized with sudden clarity, that changed everything. She's the genuine article. That transformed the mathematics of risk completely. If she was authentic intelligence operative, rather than desperate amateur in over her head, then saving her wasn't just moral obligation driven by his grandfather's teachings about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was military necessity that could determine the outcome of their entire campaign against Holstead's conspiracy. Whatever she had learned inside his compound during her brief infiltration, whatever photographs she had managed to take with that fancy wet plate apparatus, glass plates, and a sliding box field camera, before discovery could be crucial to stopping the water theft operation before it destroyed everything his people had built along this river over generations of careful cultivation. "Easy, boy," he murmured to his horse, checking weapons and equipment with automatic efficiency born of years spent in situations where preparation meant survival and carelessness meant death. "Looks like we're about to find out whether all that army training was worth the humiliation of wearing their uniform." He spurred the paint into the torrent, just as the first rifle shot cracked across the water, with the distinctive flat report of a military carbine fired by someone who knew his business. The bullet went wide, difficult shooting from moving horseback across uncertain distance, but close enough to spray limestone chips from the boulder he'd just vacated with stinging force that reminded him these were professional killers, not drunken cowboys playing at violence for Saturday night entertainment. The current grabbed them immediately, with shocking strength that spoke of snowmelt from peaks still capped with winter's accumulation, trying to sweep horse and rider downstream into rapids that would crush bones against submerged rocks with the casual indifference of natural force unleashed. Tokala felt his mount's hooves slip and catch on the treacherous bottom, fighting for purchase against centuries of spring floods that had polished every stone smooth as glass, while carving channels deep enough to swallow armies without trace. Ice-cold water soaked through buckskin and wool in seconds, cramping muscles and shortening breath until each movement became conscious struggle against hypothermia that could kill as surely as bullets if exposure continued too long. Behind him, the riders were shouting coordination. For flanking maneuvers, not random pursuit driven by anger and opportunity, but organized military operation designed to eliminate specific target with minimum risk to attacking force. Halfway across the deadly crossing disaster struck without warning or mercy. The paint's right forefoot found a depression between two rounded stones, just as particularly violent surge pushed against them with force that spoke of massive volumes of water moving at tremendous speed. Suddenly, they were both floundering in water over Tokala's head, current seizing them like something alive and malevolent, determined to drag them down into muddy depths where they would join the countless bones of other creatures who had underestimated this river's power. The world became nightmare of churning brown water, desperate gasping for air that came mixed with silt and debris. The weight of weapons and ammunition trying to drag him down into darkness where light never penetrated and time had no meaning. Somewhere in the chaos, he lost his grip on the Spencer carbine, but managed to keep it from disappearing entirely into depths that would make it as lost as if it had never existed. His boots scraped bottom for one crucial instant contact with solid ground that lasted barely long enough to register before current tried to tear him loose again, just sufficient time to plant feet and launch himself toward the far bank, where she waited with white-knuckled hands, pressed to mouth in expression of fear and hope combined. He hit the muddy slope with jarring impact that drove breath from lungs and sent shock through bones, hauling himself up through willows and accumulated debris, while bullets whined overhead like deadly insects seeking warm blood to drink. His paint horse lunged up behind him with the trained determination of an animal that had learned to follow his rider through whatever hell they discovered together, refusing to abandon partnership, even when partnership meant sharing mortal danger. Water streamed from both of them as Tokala grabbed the woman's wrist and pulled her behind the nearest cover, a fallen cottonwood that offered minimal protection but was infinitely better than standing exposed in open ground, where professional marksmen could take careful aim without interference from wind or distance. Professional. He gasped, fighting to catch his breath while checking his rifle for water damage that could turn reliable weapon into expensive club when lives depended on accurate shooting. Pinkerton. She replied without hesitation, confirming his tactical assessment with single word that carried volumes of implication. Senior Investigator Undercover Assignment, Investigating Territorial Water Rights Fraud. Eleanor Hartwell, Chicago Office. She checked a small revolver concealed beneath her dress, with movements that spoke of extensive training and considerable experience. You must be Tokala Iron Bear. Your reputation precedes you. Reputation for what? Getting people out of situations that should have killed them 3 times over. Her smile held grim humor that matched her circumstances. Which is exactly what I need right now, assuming you're willing to extend professional courtesy to a fellow investigator. Same target, different client, He confirmed working the Spencer's lever to chamber a round while keeping one eye on their pursuers across the water. What went wrong with your infiltration? Got greedy. Found their geological survey maps and detailed engineering plans, tried to photograph everything with a small sliding box wet plate camera, with plate holders and a tucked-away cache of collodion and fixer. Someone walked in at the worst possible moment. Her voice carried the controlled tension of someone accustomed to life-or-death situations, but not comfortable with having blown an operation through overconfidence. Managed to expose several plates before they discovered me, but had to abandon most of my equipment during the extraction. What did you photograph? Proof that your cousin Yaji was right about everything. Victor Holstead is planning to redirect this entire river through controlled explosions in 3 narrow canyons. Once the charges detonate, Red Mesa River will follow new channels that bypass traditional Lakota lands, entirely flowing instead through territory that Holstead has been quietly acquiring through fraudulent claims and systematic bribery of territorial officials. The confirmation hit like physical blow, transforming suspicion into certainty, and certainty into urgent necessity for immediate action. Everything Yaji had died, trying to prove every warning he had whispered with his final breath. Every pattern that had seemed too monstrous to be credible. All of it was real, documented, already moving toward implementation that would destroy his people's way of life as effectively as military conquest, but with legal protection that made resistance appear criminal. Across the water, their pursuers had spread out along the bank, studying current and distance, while clearly debating whether the chase was worth risking their necks in that deadly torrent. The leader was a big man in expensive black coat, riding a blood bay that probably cost more than most homesteaders saw in prosperous year, clear indication of serious money behind this operation and professional standards that made casual dismissal dangerous mistake. That's not Victor himself, Eleanor said, following Tokala's gaze with trained observer's eye. That's his foreman, Black Jack Cordova, professional killer who worked for mining interests from Arizona to Montana before Holstead recruited him for special projects requiring particular expertise, such as eliminating Pinkerton agents, among other specialties. Murder, intimidation, witness, elimination, evidence, destruction, whatever the client requires to protect their interests. She checked her weapon again, ensuring full cylinder while estimating distance and angles. Whatever you're planning, decide quickly. Jack's not the type to let rushing water stop him for long, and he's got resources we can only guess at. Tokala was already calculating routes and timing, drawing on every lesson learned during 2 years of Army scouting work in hostile territory, where mistakes meant death not just for yourself, but for everyone, depending on your judgment. The current was too strong for the riders to cross where they stood, but there were other options available to men who knew the country and had time to use knowledge systematically. Upper Ford's maybe 4 miles north of here, he said, studying terrain with professional assessment. Take them 2 hours hard riding to reach it, if they push their horses another hour minimum to work back downstream to our current position. That gives us time, assuming we use it intelligently instead of wasting it on congratulations. Time for what specifically? To get you someplace safe while I figure out how to stop what your photography session interrupted. He helped her to her feet, noting how she moved despite obvious exhaustion and stress, still controlled, still thinking tactically instead of simply reacting to immediate threats. Question is where we go, that Black Jack Cordova and his associates can't follow with superior numbers and unlimited resources. Before she could formulate response, Black Jack's voice carried across the water with professional courtesy that fooled absolutely nobody who understood the nature of frontier violence and the men who made it their profession. Miss Hartwell, or whatever your real name happens to be this week, Mr. Holstead would very much like to continue your earlier conversation about photography and spying and illicit photography. Surrender now, walk out with hands visible, and we'll make this quick and clean. Professional courtesy between people who understand each other's business. Generous offer. She called back with matching false courtesy. Tell Mr. Holstead I decline with sincere thanks and suggest he find more legitimate employment before federal authorities take interest in his current activities. Thought you might say something along those lines. Blackjack's laughter held no humor whatsoever, only the cold amusement of predator who had cornered particularly challenging prey. Boys, looks like we're going to earn our pay the hard way again. The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into cottonwoods, heading north toward the upper crossing with purposeful efficiency that spoke of men who had performed similar operations many times before. But their departure brought no sense of relief, only deadline pressure that made every decision crucial and every mistake potentially fatal for more than just themselves. Can you ride hard country for extended periods? Tokala asked as his paint horse trotted over, apparently none the worse for their unplanned swimming lesson, but showing signs of fatigue that would need consideration in planning their escape route. Better than I can photograph geological surveys under pressure, apparently. She accepted his help, mounting behind the saddle with practiced ease that spoke of extensive equestrian experience. Where exactly are we going, and what kind of reception can we expect when we arrive? Someplace with defensible positions and reliable allies who share our interest in stopping Holstead's conspiracy. He guided the horse toward a game trail that led up through broken country where pursuit would be difficult and expensive in terms of time and horseflesh. But first, you're going to tell me exactly what you saw in those survey maps, every detail you can remember, because our next moves depend on understanding precisely what we're trying to prevent. As they climbed through increasingly spectacular terrain that showcased the raw beauty and deadly indifference of high country, Eleanor provided detailed briefing that confirmed Tokala's worst fears about Holstead's intentions, while adding layers of complexity that made the situation even more urgent than he had realized. The maps showed precise engineering calculations for redirecting Red Mesa River's entire flow through a series of controlled explosions in 3 narrow canyons, each selected for maximum effect with minimum visible evidence of human intervention. Once the charges detonated during spring flooding season, casual observers would assume the river had changed course naturally due to ice damage and high water pressure, leaving no obvious proof of artificial manipulation. It's not just about controlling water rights for immediate profit, Eleanor explained as they paused to rest the horse and study their back trail for signs of pursuit. It's about creating artificial scarcity that will give Holstead economic control over every ranch, farm, mining operation and settlement within 50 miles of the original river channel. Complete monopoly over the most essential resource in arid country. And the Lakota bands lose everything our people have built over generations. Tokala said with grim understanding of implications that reached far beyond immediate disaster. Our communities, our agricultural systems, our entire way of life depends on reliable water access. Without the river, traditional lands become worthless desert that can't support human habitation. Which is exactly what Holstead wants European settlement under his economic control. Indian removal without direct military action, territorial development according to his personal specifications. Her voice carried bitter understanding earned through months of investigation into systematic corruption. Your cousin Yadji was killed because he discovered preliminary test sites where Holstead's engineers were measuring explosive placement angles and calculating optimal detonation sequences. The trail they followed wound steadily upward through red sandstone formations carved by millennia of wind and weather into cathedral spires and natural amphitheaters that provided excellent concealment for small groups but would become death traps if superior forces managed to surround them. Every tactical advantage in this country came with corresponding vulnerability that experienced enemies could exploit, given sufficient time and determination. "Tell me about your partner, Anna," Takala said during another brief rest stop, studying Eleanor's face for signs of emotional involvement that might affect her professional judgment during crisis situations. What happened to her investigation, and how does it connect to current circumstances? Pain flickered across Eleanor's features, first genuinely unguarded emotion he had seen her display since their desperate river crossing under hostile fire. Professional composure cracked slightly, revealing human grief beneath trained competence. Anna Volkov, best investigator Pinkerton ever produced, specialized in territorial fraud cases involving government corruption and resource theft. She came here 20 months ago using identical cover story mail-order bride seeking legitimate marriage to prosperous cattlemen. Eleanor's hands tightened on the saddle horn as memories of loss reinforced current danger. Initially, everything went according to plan. She successfully infiltrated Holsted's social circle, gathered preliminary evidence about land acquisition irregularities and suspicious mining claims. What changed? She discovered something that made her break procedures and attempt immediate extraction instead of completing her assigned intelligence-gathering mission. The woman's voice grew harder with each word, professional analysis mixing with personal anger in dangerous combination. We never learned exactly what she found because she disappeared completely 4 days after requesting emergency extraction through coded telegram. Disappeared how specifically? Vanished from her hotel room in middle of night without taking personal belongings or leaving any indication of planned departure. Officially, Deputy U.S. Marshal Claude Brennan claimed she had eloped with traveling salesmen who happened to be passing through town at convenient time. Eleanor's expression showed exactly what she thought of that explanation. Unofficially, Pinkerton investigators found bloodstains in her room and clear signs of violent struggle, along with evidence suggesting her wet plate apparatus glass plates and a sliding box field camera had been systematically destroyed by someone familiar with photographic techniques. So you came here to finish her work. To finish it and to make Victor Holsted pay for murdering the finest investigator I ever had privilege of working with. Steel returned to Eleanor's voice, cold and professional, but underlaid with personal motivation that went far beyond duty or career advancement. Anna was more than colleague. She was mentor, friend, closest thing to family I had after my parents died in Chicago fire. Her death will not go unavenged, and her work will not remain incomplete. They reached the abandoned mining camp at Copper Gulch as afternoon shadows began their steady march across high country, transforming familiar landscape into maze of concealment and potential ambush sites that could shelter allies or enemies with equal effectiveness. The settlement showed signs of recent habitation despite its official abandonment, following played-out mineral deposits, smoke rising from what had been the assay office. Several horses tied outside in arrangements that suggested organized presence rather than casual occupation, sounds of conversation and activity that spoke of people with purpose rather than drifters seeking temporary shelter. Friends or enemies? Eleanor asked, studying the layout with trained observer's eye, while noting defensive positions, escape routes, and sight lines that would matter if circumstances required rapid tactical decisions. Allies, assuming I'm correct about who's been maintaining operations here since territorial authorities declared the site abandoned. Takala guided their horse toward the main building complex with careful attention to approaches and potential complications. People who have their own excellent reasons for wanting Victor Holsted stopped permanently before his conspiracy reaches implementation stage. 4 men emerged as they approached miners, clearly with the rock dust and powder burns that marked their profession as indelibly as scars marked veterans of Indian wars. But something in their posture and alertness suggested they were considerably more than simple prospectors, driven from legitimate claims by economic pressure and territorial corruption. Tokala Iron Bear, the largest said, extending a work-hardened hand in gesture that combined welcome with assessment. Tom Bradley, speaking for Copper Gulch Mining Cooperative. Been wondering when you'd turn up in these parts. Heard there was considerable excitement down in the valley today, along with rumors about federal investigators and Deputy U.S. Marshals. Excitement's accurate description. Takala replied, accepting the handshake and finding it firm and honest. Tom, this is Eleanor Hartwell, senior investigator with Pinkerton Detective Agency. She's been conducting undercover investigation of the same water rights conspiracy we discussed during our previous communications. Tom Bradley's eyebrows rose with surprise and considerable respect as he reassessed their unexpected visitor. Pinkerton, well. That explains why Holstead's forces have been stirred up like hornets in disturbed nest all afternoon. Ma'am, if you're here about the river business and geological manipulation, then you're exactly who we've been hoping to meet for past 6 months. The other miners introduced themselves as Pete Kowalski, Frank Morrison, and his son Henry, all displaying the careful courtesy that frontier men showed to women who had proven themselves capable of handling dangerous situations without requiring constant protection. They led the newcomers into the old assay office, where maps and documents covered every horizontal surface in organized chaos that spoke of systematic investigation conducted by people who understood both mining techniques and territorial politics. We've been gathering intelligence about Holstead's operations since last winter. Tom explained, spreading geological surveys across rough wooden table that had once been used for testing ore samples. Ever since we realized his mining claims didn't correspond to actual mineral deposits in the areas he was systematically purchasing through intermediaries and shell companies. What did your investigation reveal? Eleanor asked, studying the papers with professional interest, while noting details that connected to her own intelligence-gathering efforts. Survey markers that make no sense for legitimate mining operations. Pete replied, pointing to locations marked on detailed topographical maps. Test holes drilled at angles suggesting somebody's planning to move massive quantities of water rather than extract ore from underground deposits. And these, he produced series of technical drawings copied from sources he didn't identify. Detailed engineering specifications for explosive placement in 3 specific canyon locations calculated to redirect entire river flow with maximum efficiency. Takala examined the papers with growing recognition, identifying locations his grandfather had shown him during childhood hunting expeditions, when Old Man had shared traditional knowledge about seasonal water patterns and the sacred places where spirits of the river were strongest. Strategic choke points where controlled explosions could redirect the river's entire flow with devastating efficiency, turning life-giving water away from communities that had depended on it for generations. This is it, he said quietly, feeling weight of confirmation settle on his shoulders like burden he had always known he would eventually carry. This is what Yazi died trying to prove. Holstead's not just stealing land through legal manipulation, he's planning to steal the river itself through what amounts to criminal sabotage of the river. Situations even worse than simple theft. Frank Morrison added with grimly satisfied expression of man who had finally found audience for information that had been burning inside him for months. We intercepted correspondence between Holstead and territorial officials in Denver, including his brother James, who holds position in Territorial Water Rights Office. They're planning to legalize the theft after it happens by claiming the river changed course naturally during spring flooding season. Eleanor's professional composure cracked slightly as implications sank in. Federal survey teams will be bribed to confirm the new channel as natural geological phenomenon, providing legal cover for what amounts to the largest water rights fraud in territorial history. When, she asked with growing urgency that spoke of someone calculating time requirements against available resources. How long do we have before they implement this conspiracy? soon as spring flooding reaches peak levels. Tom replied, consulting weather reports and seasonal data compiled over years of mining experience. Weather patterns from high country suggest major snowmelt beginning within next few days, possibly sooner if temperatures continue rising. Once flooding begins in earnest, they can detonate charges and claim explosions were triggered by natural water pressure against weakened canyon walls. Perfect cover for artificial manipulation, Eleanor concluded with professional assessment of criminal methodology. Investigators arriving after the fact would find evidence consistent with natural disaster rather than deliberate sabotage. Testimony from local witnesses could be dismissed as confused recollections from people traumatized by unexpected environmental catastrophe. The implications hit Tokala like series of physical blows, each realization adding weight to growing understanding of conspiracy's scope and sophistication. Not just immediate disaster for Lakota bands depending on river water for survival, but precedent that would encourage similar schemes throughout frontier territories where wealthy investors sought to concentrate natural resources under private control. If Holstead succeeded here, other men with sufficient capital and political connections would attempt comparable resource theft in different locations using environmental disasters as cover for artificial manipulation of water mineral rights, timber access, and agricultural potential. Pattern of exploitation that could transform entire American West into private kingdoms controlled by Eastern money and protected by corrupted territorial governments. We have to stop them, Tokala said with flat certainty that admitted no alternative outcomes. Question is how we accomplish it when they control local law enforcement, have territorial authority in their pocket, and federal investigators are too distant to intervene effectively before the conspiracy reaches completion. Actually, Eleanor said thoughtfully, weighing tactical options with professional calculation, distance might work in our favor if we approach the problem strategically rather than simply reacting to immediate threats. Federal prosecutors don't need to prevent crimes in progress if they have documented proof of conspiracy after completion. Territorial officials can be bypassed entirely through federal jurisdiction, assuming we can provide evidence that meets federal court standards. What kind of evidence specifically? Pete asked with interest, born of months spent gathering intelligence without clear understanding of legal requirements. Physical proof of explosive placement and engineering calculations. Photographic documentation of conspiracy planning and implementation. Testimony from credible witnesses who can confirm artificial causation rather than natural disaster. She paused mentally, reviewing available resources and operational requirements. I have professional wet plate apparatus glass plates and a sliding box field camera cached in secure location near Willow Springs. If we can reach the canyon sites before they detonate charges, document everything systematically. Assuming they haven't accelerated their timeline because of your blown cover. Frank Morrison pointed out with pessimistic realism, born of experience with criminal psychology. Holstead knows you photographed something important in his private study. He might move immediately to prevent any interference with conspiracy he spent months implementing. Before anyone could respond to that sobering possibility, sounds of approaching horses filled the evening air. Multiple riders moving at considerable speed through terrain that demanded careful navigation under optimal conditions. Through windows, they could see torchlight reflecting off weapons and official badges as substantial force surrounded their position with military precision. Deputy U.S. Marshals. A familiar voice called from outside with authority that carried poorly concealed threat. You're harboring federal fugitives and stolen territorial property. Come out immediately, with hands visible and weapons surrendered. But Tokala recognized the voice despite official proclamation, Black Jack Cordova wearing territorial authority like mask over his true nature, as professional killer working for private interests. Somehow, Holstead's forces had reached them despite difficult terrain and limited time available, which suggested either superior local knowledge or advanced positioning that indicated this entire situation was evolving according to enemy planning, rather than random pursuit. Back entrance. Tom Bradley said immediately, moving toward rear exit with efficiency that spoke of contingency planning. Trail leads up into high country, where mounted pursuit becomes extremely difficult. If we can reach the old Indian caves before they organize systematic search. Wait, Eleanor interrupted, holding up restraining hand while her mind raced through tactical calculations. If we run now, we lose any realistic chance of stopping the explosive operation before implementation. They'll move immediately to prevent our interference, probably detonate charges tonight, while we're scattered in wilderness without resources or communication capabilities. No, better scattered and alive than captured and dead. Frank Morrison observed with pragmatic assessment of their tactical situation. Not necessarily true, she replied, professional training overriding natural survival instincts. Blackjack's not here to eliminate us immediately. He's here to capture us alive for interrogation. Holstead desperately needs to know what I photographed, who I've contacted, how much federal authorities understand about his conspiracy. Dead agents can't provide that crucial intelligence. So, what exactly do you propose? We give him what he expects to want, but not what he actually needs. Her smile carried cold calculation that spoke of someone accustomed to high-stakes deception. I surrender myself as primary target, drawing their complete attention away from you and the evidence we've compiled. Once they have me for interrogation, you'll have operational freedom to act against the explosive sites without interference. That's suicide. Takala said bluntly, remembering Anna Volkov's fate and recognizing similar pattern developing. Holstead's not known for keeping prisoners alive after extracting whatever information they possess. Probably accurate assessment. But it's also our only realistic chance of preventing a catastrophe upon the river that would affect thousands of people across multiple territories. She met his eyes directly with expression that combined professional determination with personal resolve. This is what Anna died trying to accomplish. I will not let her sacrifice become meaningless through failure of courage when success remains possible. Takala found himself studying Eleanor's face in flickering lamplight, seeing past professional competence to something deeper and more personal. Determination that went beyond duty or career advancement, rooted in grief and guilt that had shaped every choice she had made since arriving in Colorado territory. She was prepared to die for this mission, just as Yaji had died trying to expose Holstead's conspiracy, just as Anna Volkov had died getting too close to dangerous truths. But maybe she doesn't have to die, he thought, with sudden inspiration born of desperation and tactical training. Maybe there's another approach that gives us advantages, instead of simply choosing between different types of failure. What if we don't give them what they expect? He said slowly, plan crystallizing as he spoke. What if we give them something that serves our purposes better than theirs? Such as what specifically? Me. Takala's strategy was taking shape with clarity that came from understanding both enemy psychology and available resources. Blackjack's been hunting both of us, but from his perspective, I'm the primary tactical threat armed Indian with military training who's been interfering with territorial authority and official law enforcement operations. I don't follow your reasoning. Strategic misdirection based on enemy assumptions about threat priorities. I surrender to Blackjack as armed fugitive resisting territorial authority, while you disappear during confusion of capture. Once they have me, they'll assume you're secondary target, who can be hunted systematically after they extract information from primary prisoner, except they'll torture you for intelligence just as brutally as they would torture me. Critical difference is that I don't possess detailed knowledge about Pinkerton operations, federal investigation procedures, or evidence-gathering techniques. I'm simply local scout employed by Indian Council to investigate water rights issues affecting tribal lands. Tokala's voice carried conviction born of tactical necessity. They can torture me extensively. Worst I can reveal is Lakota concerns about river access and traditional territorial boundaries. Tom Bradley was nodding slowly as he grasped tactical advantages of proposed deception. It might work effectively assuming you can make surrender appear convincing rather than obviously planned misdirection. But you'd need significant distraction to sell the performance properly. Leave that particular problem to us, Pete Kowalski added with grim satisfaction. We've got enough cached mining explosives here to create very convincing distraction indeed, plus intimate knowledge of local geology that comes from years of underground work. Outside, Blackjack's voice was growing increasingly impatient with delay that suggested resistance or escape attempts. You people have exactly 2 minutes to emerge peacefully, with hands visible. After that deadline expires, we're coming inside with fire and steel. Then we'd better implement this plan immediately, Eleanor said, checking her concealed weapon while preparing for whatever came next. Before I commit to trusting you with my life and mission success, I should know your complete name and background. Professional courtesy between people risking everything on mutual cooperation. Tokala Iron Bear, grandson of Chief Broken Arrow Scout for Oglala Lakota Band, sworn to protect the sacred waters that give life to our people, according to treaties made with the Great Spirit himself. He responded with formal dignity that matched the gravity of their situation. What about you? Your real identity and personal stake in this mission? Eleanor Marie Hartwell, senior investigator with Pinkerton Detective Agency's Chicago office, sworn to uphold federal law regardless of personal cost. She paused, studying his face with expression that combined professional assessment with something more personal. Also sworn to complete Anna Volkov's investigation and ensure her death serves justice, rather than simply adding another name to list of murdered Deputy U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton men. You don't have to risk everything for strangers and causes that aren't your direct responsibility. Yes, I do. The moment Victor Holstead murdered a federal investigator to protect his conspiracy, he made it personal. Tokala checked his weapons systematically, ensuring they would function properly during whatever deception they were about to attempt. Besides, someone needs to ensure you survive long enough to finish Anna's work and make Yazi's death meaningful. What followed was 15 minutes of precise coordination under extreme pressure, with each participant understanding that mistakes would likely prove fatal for everyone involved. Pete and Frank positioned cached explosives to create maximum confusion, without bringing down entire mountainside on their own heads. Tom Bradley prepared escape routes and emergency supply caches for Eleanor's journey to explosive sites. Henry Morrison, despite his youth, proved invaluable in coordinating timing and communications between team members. And Tokala steeled himself for what might be his final act of service to people he had sworn to protect, knowing that success would prevent disaster for thousands, while failure would simply add his name to a growing list of casualties in Holstead's war against anyone who threatened his ambitions. The explosion, when it came, lit up entire canyon like premature sunrise, arriving 8 hours early. Carefully controlled detonation that brought down substantial portion of the camp's eastern perimeter wall while leaving predetermined escape routes intact, creating chaos that would require several minutes for Blackjack's forces to analyze and respond to effectively. In that precious window of confusion, Eleanor Hartwell disappeared into darkness, like smoke dissipating in wind, carrying with her knowledge, determination, and photographic evidence needed to stop Holstead's conspiracy through federal intervention. and Tokala Iron Bear walked out to meet territorial authority, with hands raised and weapons surrendered, purchasing time she needed with his freedom and quite possibly his life. "Well, well," Blackjack Cordova said, as Torchlight revealed his prized professional satisfaction evident in voice and posture. "The famous Indian scout who's been causing so much expensive trouble for legitimate business interests. Mr. Holstead is going to be extremely pleased to finally make your personal acquaintance." As they bound his hands with unnecessary roughness and loaded him onto spare horse-like captured equipment, Tokala caught brief glimpse of Eleanor's shadow, moving through rocks above canyon rim. Still free, still carrying hope for justice in land, where justice was usually purchased by highest bidder and delivered according to economic rather than moral considerations. Make it count, he thought, directing wish toward her distant figure with intensity born of understanding what failure would cost. Make Yaji's death serve some larger purpose. Make Anna's sacrifice prevent disaster rather than simply adding to tragedy. Make all of this suffering mean something. The ride to Victor Holstead's compound consumed most of remaining night, following trails that wound through increasingly cultivated country, where European settlement had systematically replaced traditional Lakota hunting grounds, with fenced property lines and agricultural development designed to serve distant markets rather than local needs. By dawn, they were approaching complex of buildings that spoke of serious wealth deployed with careful attention to both comfort and security. Not just ranch headquarters, but fortress designed to withstand prolonged siege if political circumstances required defensive measures. Victor Holstead himself waited in main building's central chamber, and Tokala understood immediately why this particular man had been able to corrupt territorial authority so effectively while maintaining appearance of legitimate business operations. Tall, distinguished, possessing commanding presence that made people want to follow his leadership even when that leadership pointed toward moral compromise. He represented everything dangerous about intelligence applied to evil purposes. "Mr. Iron Bear," Holstead said with courteous formality that masked calculation behind every word. "I've heard quite remarkable things about your recent activities throughout this district. Please make yourself comfortable. I believe we have several important matters to discuss before circumstances require more direct persuasion techniques." Tokala remained standing, despite obvious exhaustion meeting the man's gaze directly, without showing intimidation or submission. "Nothing to discuss with you, Holstead. You're stealing our people's water through sabotage and fraud. We're going to stop you through whatever means prove necessary." "Stealing water." Holstead's eyebrows rose with apparent surprise that fooled absolutely nobody present. "My dear fellow, water rights throughout this territory are governed by injunctions issued by the federal court and charges brought by the U.S. Attorney and territorial regulations developed specifically to prevent conflicts over natural resources. Everything I'm undertaking has been properly documented through official channels and legally approved by appropriate authorities. By territorial officials, you've systematically bribed to ignore federal law. That represents serious accusation requiring substantial proof to support in any legitimate legal proceeding. Do you possess such evidence, or are you simply repeating unfounded rumors circulated by people who resent economic development and territorial progress?" Tokala maintained silence, letting tension stretch between them, while understanding this represented psychological warfare designed to extract information about opposition capabilities and federal investigation scope. Every word could reveal intelligence that would endanger Eleanor's mission or compromise other aspects of resistance to Holstead's conspiracy. "Perhaps I should share certain information with you." Holstead continued moving to detailed map mounted prominently on wall for maximum psychological impact. The Red Mesa River's current course represents artificial channel created centuries ago by beaver dam construction and subsequent Ice Age glacier activity. Its original natural flow pattern followed these indicated channels. He gestured toward lines drawn directly across traditional Lakota territorial boundaries, which happened to traverse land I've legally purchased from territorial authority according to established homestead and mining claim procedures. Legal documentation doesn't automatically confer moral legitimacy. Perhaps not in philosophical sense, but it does establish enforceability through territorial courts backed by federal deputy U.S. Marshals and military authority when circumstances require official intervention. Holstead's mask of reasonable discourse was beginning to slip as his true nature emerged. Your people have been occupying federal territory without proper documentation or legal recognition. When the river returns to its natural historical course, that irregular situation will be permanently clarified. By destroying 3 canyon locations with mining explosives strategically placed to redirect water flow. The words achieved their intended effect perfectly. Holstead's carefully controlled expression flickered with surprise and rapid calculation before professional composure reasserted itself through sheer force of will. But damage was already done. His reaction confirmed knowledge of specific technical details that could only have come from infiltration of his private planning sessions. I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. Of course not. Just like you had no knowledge of why Yaji Iron Bear had to die when he discovered your preliminary test sites and engineering surveys. Tokala allowed controlled contempt to enter his voice. Just like you had no involvement in Anna Volkov's disappearance after she photographed evidence of your conspiracy to commit criminal sabotage of the river. Anna Volkov, the Pinkerton agent who exceeded her investigative authority and suffered predictable consequences of her excessive curiosity. Holstead was no longer bothering with pretense of legitimate business operations. Unfortunate woman who failed to understand that certain information carries fatal risks for those who acquire it improperly. Except, I'm not operating alone this time, and federal authorities have been monitoring your activities longer than you realize. Are they indeed? Your Pinkerton associate is probably dead by now. Blackjack's tracking teams have been systematically covering every possible escape route since she disappeared during last night's confusion. And even if she somehow managed temporary evasion, she cannot possibly reach federal authorities quickly enough to prevent tomorrow morning's geological adjustment. Tomorrow morning. So Eleanor had perhaps 12 hours to document explosive sites, contact federal investigators, and coordinate intervention before Holstead's conspiracy reached irreversible implementation. Barely possible under optimal conditions, assuming everything proceeded without complications, and she encountered no additional obstacles during her desperate race against engineered disaster, which meant Tokala's primary responsibility was buying additional time by keeping Holstead distracted and uncertain about opposition capabilities, federal investigation scope, and documented evidence that might already be in official hands. Tell me about your engineering consultants, he said, adopting conversational tone designed to suggest insider knowledge. Impressive technical achievement planning controlled explosions with sufficient precision to redirect entire river system. Must have required specialists with considerable experience in large-scale demolition projects. Once again, surprise flickered across Holstead's features before professional control reasserted itself. You seem remarkably well informed for simple tribal scout employed to investigate water access issues. Yaji Iron Bear was extremely thorough investigator before you arranged his murder. He documented everything he discovered, including correspondence between your organization and territorial officials regarding federal survey falsification procedures. Complete fabrication, but delivered with conviction that came from desperation and tactical necessity. Including specific communications with your brother James regarding water rights manipulation and territorial authority corruption. Holstead remained silent for extended period, weighing risks and calculating options, while studying his prisoner for signs of deception or bluff. If Tokala was revealing accurate information about documented evidence, then entire conspiracy might be compromised, regardless of whether tomorrow's explosive operation succeeded in redirecting river flow according to plan. Federal prosecutors with solid documentary proof of territorial corruption could dismantle years of careful political preparation, even after environmental manipulation had been completed and legalized through fraudulent survey reports. Dead martyrs sometimes accomplished more through their documented testimony than living investigators could achieve through continued opposition. Where are these alleged documents currently located? Holstead asked with dangerous quietness. Secure location known to federal authorities who have been monitoring your conspiracy longer than you suspect. Along with photographic evidence your Pinkerton infiltrator managed to obtain before her cover was compromised. Another fabrication based on reasonable supposition. But Eleanor had struck him as professional, who would have established insurance policies to protect crucial intelligence, even if primary mission failed catastrophically. I believe you're fabricating testimony to create uncertainty about precautions. Perhaps I am. But can you afford to discover the truth after irreversible action has been taken? Tokala met Holstead's stare steadily. While internal clock counted precious minutes Eleanor needed to complete her mission. Federal prosecutors don't require living witnesses if they possess documented proof of conspiracy to commit sabotage against United States territories. Their confrontation was interrupted by urgent commotion outside, horses arriving at tremendous speed, men shouting reports that clearly carried disturbing news for someone. Through windows, Tokala could observe Blackjack Cordova dismounting with expression that promised unpleasant revelations for his employer. Mr. Holstead, Blackjack announced as he entered, sparing barely a glance for prisoner, while focusing complete attention on crisis management. We have serious problems developing. Multiple serious problems. Explain the situation systematically. The Pinkerton woman escaped completely during that mining explosion. Our tracking teams lost her trail in rocky terrain above timberline, and she could be anywhere within 50-mile radius by now. Blackjack's professional composure showed strain that came from reporting failure to employer who didn't tolerate incompetence. But that's not the worst development. Continue your report. Someone has been systematically interfering with our canyon preparation work. Found 4 members of our demolition team dead this morning. Charges at Site 2 completely removed and destroyed by person or persons with professional knowledge of explosive techniques. Work at remaining sites may be similarly compromised. Tokala felt surge of fierce satisfaction despite his increasingly dangerous position. Eleanor had reached explosive sites faster than anyone thought possible, and was methodically sabotaging Holstead's carefully prepared criminal sabotage of the river with expertise that spoke of technical training beyond simple photography and investigation. Anna Volkov's death was being avenged through direct action that would prevent conspiracy implementation while gathering evidence necessary for federal prosecution. Yazi Ironbear's sacrifice was finally serving larger purpose than simply adding another victim to Holstead's growing list of inconvenient people who had been permanently silenced. How many sites remain operational? Holstead demanded with controlled fury that made his previous courtesy seem like elaborate theatrical performance. Uncertain at present time. We're conducting systematic inspection of all prepared locations, but she's moving rapidly and appears to know exactly what she's looking for. Blackjack consulted notes scrawled on paper stained with what appeared to be blood. Professional sabotage work, whoever trained her understood demolition techniques as thoroughly as photography. Pinkerton agents receive comprehensive technical training. Tokala observed with satisfaction he made no effort to conceal. including explosives handling evidence documentation and federal law enforcement coordination procedures. Holstead's attention swung back to his prisoner with deadly intensity that suggested interrogation was about to become significantly more unpleasant. Comprehensive training in federal law enforcement coordination, meaning she's already contacted Deputy U.S. Marshals or federal investigators. Meaning your conspiracy has been under federal surveillance longer than you suspected, and documented evidence has been accumulating for months while you congratulated yourself on superior precautions. Pure bluff delivered with conviction, born of desperation, but based on reasonable assessment of Pinkerton capabilities and federal interest in territorial corruption. Perhaps. But you're going to provide detailed information about federal investigation scope, documented evidence, and coordination procedures. Holstead nodded toward Blackjack, with expression that promised extended unpleasantness. Prepare torture procedures. I want complete intelligence about opposition capabilities within next 2 hours. As they prepared to drag him toward what was obviously purpose-built facility designed for extracting information from unwilling subjects, Tokala caught sight of dust cloud developing on distant horizon. Multiple riders approaching from direction of Denver, moving at maximum sustainable speed, and displaying federal colors that spoke of legitimate authority rather than corrupted territorial law enforcement. Eleanor had accomplished impossible, reaching federal investigators, providing convincing evidence of conspiracy, and guiding official response back to Holstead's headquarters before explosive operation could be completed. Anna Volkov's work was finally approaching successful conclusion through courage and competence of partner, who had refused to let murder silence federal investigation. But would legitimate authority arrive quickly enough to prevent Holstead from destroying evidence and eliminating witnesses? And would Tokala survive interrogation long enough to provide testimony supporting federal prosecution of conspiracy that had already cost too many lives? The torture facility represented everything Tokala had expected from man, who built criminal empire through systematic application of violence against anyone who threatened his interests. Soundproofed chamber, equipped with restraints designed to break both physical resistance and psychological determination of subjects unfortunate enough to require Holstead's personal attention. Blackjack Cordova worked with professional efficiency that spoke of extensive experience in extracting intelligence from people who possessed information their captors needed desperately enough to employ whatever persuasion techniques proved necessary. Pain became comprehensive environment rather than simple sensation expanding to fill consciousness until resistance seemed impossible, and cooperation appeared to be only rational response to circumstance. Federal investigation procedures. Holstead repeated with patient determination that made his words more terrifying than shouted threats. Documented evidence locations. Coordination protocols with Deputy U.S. Marshals and federal prosecutors. Everything you know about opposition capabilities and planned intervention strategies. But Tokala held on to single thought that gave meaning to suffering beyond simple endurance. Eleanor was still free, still fighting, still carrying hope for justice in land where justice had been systematically corrupted by wealth and political influence. Every minute he remained silent was minute she could use to complete mission that would prevent a catastrophe upon the river while bringing federal prosecution to conspiracy that reached territorial government itself. Through techniques his grandfather had taught for surviving torture without losing essential spiritual integrity, he focused awareness on flowing water rather than immediate pain, on sacred responsibility, rather than physical agony, on duty to future generations, rather than present suffering that would eventually end regardless of his choices. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes stretched into eternal moments, where time lost objective meaning and endurance became matter of spiritual rather than physical strength. But gradually, even Holstead's patience began showing strain as systematic application of professional interrogation techniques produced no useful intelligence whatsoever. He's not going to provide voluntary cooperation. Blackjack observed with professional assessment that combined frustration with grudging respect. Some subjects possess psychological resistance that exceeds physical breaking points. This one would die before revealing information that could compromise his people's interests. Then we'll arrange public execution as demonstration to other potential troublemakers. Holstead replied with cold calculation that viewed human life as expendable resource. Charge him with murdering our demolition team members that should satisfy territorial law enforcement requirements while eliminating witness who could testify about our operations. But before they could implement that final solution to their prisoner problem, sounds of substantial conflict erupted throughout compound gunfire, shouted federal commands, authority of legitimate law enforcement, backed by superior numbers and legal warrants that superseded any territorial corruption. Victor Holstead. Eleanor Hartwell's voice carried across compound with crisp professionalism that cut through chaos like blade through silk. This is Senior Investigator Hartwell Pinkerton Detective Agency, operating under direct federal authority. You're completely surrounded by Deputy U.S. Marshals, and Deputy U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton men. Surrender immediately, and you'll receive fair trial under federal jurisdiction. Through small window that provided limited view of compound yard, Tokala could observe federal forces deployed with military precision around Holstead's fortress. Not just Deputy U.S. Marshals, whose loyalty might be questionable, but genuine Deputy U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton men with authority that superseded any local corruption or political influence. Eleanor had accomplished what seemed impossible, reaching Denver headquarters, convincing federal prosecutors to dispatch immediate intervention force, and guiding official response back to conspiracy headquarters before evidence could be destroyed or witnesses eliminated permanently. Impossible timing. Holstead breathed, watching his carefully constructed criminal empire collapse in real time. Federal authorities cannot possibly have responded so quickly to intelligence gathered during single night's investigation. There hasn't been sufficient time for proper legal procedures. Actually, there has been more than adequate time. Eleanor replied, approaching under flag of truce with confidence that came from superior legal position. Federal investigation of territorial corruption has been ongoing for 8 months under direct supervision from Washington. Your conspiracy was already under systematic surveillance when I arrived to gather final documentary evidence. She held up wet plate apparatus glass plates and a sliding box field camera and collection of glass photographic plates with obvious satisfaction. Comprehensive documentation of explosive placement, detailed engineering specifications, correspondence with territorial officials, financial records demonstrating systematic bribery of public servants. Everything required for federal prosecution of largest water rights fraud and criminal sabotage of the river conspiracy in territorial history. Holstead's face cycled through rapid succession of expressions: surprise at scope of federal investigation, calculation of remaining options, desperate rage at years of careful planning, destroyed, and finally cold acceptance of defeat that came with understanding his situation was completely hopeless. But acceptance of defeat didn't necessarily mean peaceful surrender, especially for man who had built criminal empire through systematic application of violence and intimidation against anyone who threatened his economic interests or political ambitions. Blackjack, he said with quiet intensity that carried more menace than shouted threats. Eliminate the prisoner immediately. If we're facing federal prosecution anyway, we might as well ensure some of our enemies don't survive to provide testimony. But as Blackjack reached for his weapon with professional efficiency, Tokala implemented desperate gambit based on months of careful observation during reconnaissance missions throughout territorial mining districts. torture chamber, like many buildings constructed during territorial period, possessed structural vulnerabilities that professional torturers had overlooked in their focus on psychological rather than architectural considerations. Heavy iron brazier used for heating torture implements sat directly beneath wooden support beam that bore substantial load from upper floor construction. Beam that had been systematically weakened by years of heat exposure and was connected to primary support post that carried weight from entire section of building's roof structure. With final reserves of strength, supplemented by determination that came from understanding what failure would cost his people, Tokala threw himself against that crucial support post, using momentum and leverage to accomplish what raw muscle alone could never achieve against properly constructed building. Ancient wood dried by years of desert climate and weakened by systematic heat damage cracked with sound like rifle shot. Suddenly, entire section of roof structure was collapsing in cascade of debris, burning coals, and structural timber that transformed interrogation chamber into chaos, where survival took precedence over prisoner control. In confusion that followed architectural collapse, Eleanor Hartwell demonstrated why Pinkerton Detective Agency had selected her for complex undercover investigation of territorial corruption. Moving with practiced efficiency that combined tactical training with situational awareness, she coordinated federal assault that overwhelmed Holstead's remaining defenders while ensuring minimal casualties among both attacking forces and defending personnel. Victor Holstead himself attempted final stand in his private office, surrounded by maps and documents that chronicled years of systematic theft, criminal sabotage of the river, and political corruption reaching territorial government offices. But when confronted with choice between hopeless resistance and federal custody, even his twisted pride recognized futility of continued defiance. "I surrender to federal authority," he announced with formal dignity that seemed almost absurd under circumstances. "I demand proper legal representation and fair trial under established territorial statutes governing civilian legal proceedings." "You'll receive exactly that treatment," Eleanor replied with professional satisfaction. "Along with federal charges for conspiracy against United States territories, systematic fraud, criminal sabotage of the river, witness intimidation, and murder in the first degree." As Deputy U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton men systematically secured prisoners and began cataloging evidence that would support prosecution of conspiracy reaching territorial capital, Eleanor found Tokala receiving medical attention from Deputy U.S. Marshal with professional training in treating injuries sustained during law enforcement operations. Burns from heated metal would heal with proper treatment, cuts from debris would close without permanent damage, but psychological trauma from systematic torture would require longer recovery period before complete restoration of normal function. "Mission status report," he asked as she approached, professional concern overriding personal discomfort. "Complete operational success achieved through coordinated federal intervention," she replied with satisfaction earned through months of dangerous undercover work and personal sacrifice. "All explosive sites secured and demolished safely, comprehensive evidence gathered and documented, territorial corruption network exposed and dismantled through systematic investigation." She settled beside him with visible relief, professional composure finally allowing exhaustion to show through facade of competent efficiency. "Anna Volkov's investigation has been completed successfully. Yaji Iron Bear's death has been avenged through prevention of a catastrophe upon the river and prosecution of conspiracy that caused his murder. And the river itself flows free and unobstructed as it has for countless generations, protected by federal law and backed by documented proof of Holstead's conspiracy to redirect its course through criminal sabotage of the river." Eleanor's smile held deep satisfaction that came from mission accomplished despite extraordinary personal risk. Your people's traditional water rights are subject to federal injunction and prosecution under existing federal authority, supported by evidence that no territorial corruption can challenge or overturn. As sun set over Red Mesa River, painting its waters with gold and crimson light in ancient patterns that no human scheming could alter or control, Tokala found himself contemplating choices and consequences that had brought them through months of danger to this moment of qualified victory. About courage that came from protecting something larger and more important than personal safety or individual ambition. About justice that sometimes required extraordinary sacrifice and risk to achieve in land where wealth and political influence could corrupt any system designed to protect ordinary people from predatory exploitation. "What happens now?" he asked, as Deputy U.S. Marshals and Pinkerton men prepared to transport prisoners toward Denver and territorial trials that would expose corruption reaching highest levels of territorial government. With primary investigation concluded and conspiracy permanently dismantled, what's next for senior investigator Eleanor Hartwell? Probably reassignment to another territorial fraud case involving systematic corruption and resource theft. She replied thoughtfully. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of wealthy men who believe federal law doesn't apply to their particular economic ambitions or political schemes. She paused, studying his face in fading light that softened harsh lines carved by pain and exhaustion. "But I've been seriously considering request for permanent assignment to Colorado Territory Office. Seems like there might be ongoing need for investigator familiar with local conditions, tribal law, and frontier justice procedures. Local conditions can prove challenging for people accustomed to civilized amenities and urban conveniences. I've discovered considerable appreciation for frontier advantages during recent months." Eleanor replied with warmth that transcended professional courtesy. "Such as opportunity to work with partners who understand that some principles matter more than personal safety or career advancement." Her voice carried deeper meaning that had nothing to do with official Pinkerton policies. Partners who risk everything to protect what they believe in, regardless of personal cost or probability of success. 8 months later, Eleanor Marie Hartwell and Tokala Iron Bear were married by federal territorial judge in ceremony that drew official representatives from Lakota Tribal Council, Pinkerton Detective Agency headquarters, and territorial government offices seeking to demonstrate their commitment to legitimate law enforcement after systematic purge of corrupted officials. Not political alliance designed to serve institutional interests, but genuine union based on mutual respect, earned through shared danger, common purpose, and recognition that their individual capabilities were enhanced rather than diminished through partnership that combined different strengths and perspectives. They established private detective agencies specializing in investigation of territorial fraud, despoiling of the river, and systematic corruption affecting both Indian territories and European settlements throughout Colorado and adjoining regions. First major case involved land speculation scheme in Wyoming Territory that had defrauded immigrant families of legitimate homestead claims. Second investigation exposed timber rights fraud in Montana that threatened traditional hunting grounds while enriching Eastern investors through systematic theft of federal resources. Third case prevented mining consortium from poisoning reservation water supplies through illegal chemical dumping designed to drive tribal communities away from mineral-rich lands that could then be acquired through fraudulent claims and territorial manipulation. Each investigation reinforced their understanding that justice in frontier territories required constant vigilance against wealth and political influence, that viewed law as commodity to be purchased rather than principle to be upheld regardless of personal cost or institutional pressure. On spring evening, exactly 3 years after their first desperate meeting at Red Mesa River Crossing, They sat together on porch of ranch house they had constructed in sheltered valley, where Copper Creek joined main river channel. Water ran clear and strong, carrying life to everything downstream just as it had for centuries before human scheming had threatened its natural course through artificial manipulation and criminal sabotage of the river. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Victor Holstead's conspiracy had succeeded? Eleanor asked, watching sunset paint distant mountains in familiar shades of gold and purple that marked another day's transition into peaceful evening. Every single day, Tokala admitted with honesty earned through years of partnership that allowed complete truth between them. But wondering about disasters that didn't occur wastes mental energy better spent preventing ones that might still develop if we remain vigilant and committed to justice. Jorg, very philosophical perspective for man who makes his living investigating territorial corruption and fraud. Learned that wisdom from Pinkerton agent, who demonstrated that justice sometimes requires extraordinary courage and personal sacrifice to achieve in land where wealth and political influence systematically corrupt institutions designed to protect ordinary people. From their barn came familiar sounds of horses settling contentedly for night's rest, and from Creek, the evening symphony of frogs and night birds, whose survival depended on flowing water that had been preserved through their combined efforts and federal intervention. Normal sounds of normal life in territory where normal had been achieved through extraordinary effort by people who understood that some things, clean water, honest government protection of traditional rights, were worth fighting for regardless of personal danger or probability of success against superior resources and political connections. Above them, stars appeared gradually in darkening sky, following ancient patterns that had guided travelers and dreamers since time beyond memory. Somewhere among those distant lights, Tokala reflected with satisfaction that came from duty, fulfilled Yazi, Iron Bear's spirit, might be watching and approving. His cousin had believed passionately that water belonged to all living things, not just those wealthy enough to steal it through legal manipulation and criminal sabotage of the river. Anna Volkov was present too in memory, and continuing influence finally at peace, knowing her investigation had been completed successfully by partner, who understood that justice delayed through intimidation and murder was justice that demanded extraordinary measures to achieve. But justice accomplished through courage and determination was justice that would endure across generations. Ready to go inside? Eleanor asked as mountain evening grew cool and stars brightened into familiar constellations that marked seasonal progression. Ready. Tokala agreed with contentment that came from partnership tested by extreme circumstances and found worthy of complete trust. They entered their home together, closing door on darkness and painful memories of past struggles, prepared for whatever tomorrow's investigations might demand of their combined abilities and shared commitment to justice in land, where justice remained work in progress rather than guaranteed outcome. In a world where corruption and greed constantly threatened innocent people who lacked resources to protect themselves against systematic exploitation, they had discovered fundamental truth that sustained them through every challenge, that two people working together with common purpose, complementary skills, and absolute trust could accomplish things that neither could achieve alone, no matter how determined or capable they might be as individuals. Together, they would continue fighting for justice throughout frontier territories where law was still being written and institutions were still being tested against human nature's capacity for both nobility and corruption. One case at a time, one victory at a time, trusting in each other and principles that had brought them through their darkest hours into this precious light of partnership and purpose.